Thank you all for coming back. Delighted to see you here, and before we get on to the material today, let me do two things. Number one, do you know the little booklet that is given away in Talbot County? What is it called? Tidewater Times?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
This month's edition has a very good article on John Tyler.
Oh, really?
So many of us receive it or take it home and leave it someplace. It's very well written and it's very accurate. There's one exception, and we'll touch on that.
Okay.
But otherwise, it's.
Who wrote it?
I do not remember the gentleman's name, but he writes very, very well.
Italian.
Could be,
Did
but I do not remember it, so.
Did Tyler have anything to do with the Eastern Shore or anything? I mean, you said recent.
Very little,
Okay.
very little.
I just wondered why they choose Tyler to put in that.
It's apparently a series called on precedents, Precedents. But if you want to refer to that, it's very readable. The other thing I wanted to point out to you is that you will receive a request from Chesapeake Forum to review or grade or assess these sessions. So if you like these sessions and you would like to see more and that, and you have nice things to say about this, please fill it in and send it to Chesapeake Forum.
Sure.
On the other hand, if there was something that you did not like or that negative about, send the evaluation to me and I'll make sure that they never see it. So we're clear on that. Today we're going to talk about John Tyler. John Tyler was a Virginian by birth. He was the son of a wealthy man who was an attorney, a landowner, and also his family owned slaves. There's no question about it. Tyler himself got to own a significant number of slaves, over 50 of them. And rumor has it that many of them were his children too. That has never been verified. But nevertheless, he was born in a privileged family and went to the College of William and Mary. And later on, like many of his colleagues, he studied law and was admitted to the bar. He was only 21 when he was admitted to the legislature of Virginia. And at age 27, he made it to the United States House of Representatives. So from very early on, he had the ability to be a leader of men and be acceptable to his peers, both in the State House and in the United States House of Representatives. He went on to be elected governor of Virginia and was appointed to the U.S. Senate by the legislature after his term was completed. I don't need to remind you that up until 1913, senators were appointed by the legislatures, not elected, appointed by the legislature. So generally speaking, it was said that the House of Representatives represented the people. The U.S. Senate represented the state's legislatures, which were not the same. Correct? That's a general civics concept to remember. So when Tyler went to the Senate, he was recognized as a Jeffersonian Democrat. Remember early on that the politics in the states were divided into the northern Federalists and the Southern Democratic Republicans. The Federalists wanted a strong government, a government of the few. They wanted a high tariff, that is, taxes on imports. And they were in favor of things like what we now call infrastructure projects, bridges, roads, internal improvements. While the Jeffersonian Democrats were primarily a party of the middle states and the southern states. They envisioned a nation of farmers, of agricultural interests, with, of course, slavery for the South, but no tariffs and no internal improvements. Their argument was this: look, we live in Mississippi. Why should our money be invested in the Erie Canal that benefits mostly New York? Well, we know now that things like that benefit the whole nation. But at that time, their view was very limited. So the Southern, or the Democratic Republicans, the party of Jefferson, envisioned a nation of the many, rather than the Federalists that envisioned a nation, a government of the few. Okay. Are those concepts clear? Do you remember that from civics and history and whatnot? Okay, good. So Tyler, when he was in the Senate, he opposed the National Bank, and we discussed this already, the benefits and pros and cons of the National Bank. The National Bank, he opposed the tariffs and a federal communications network. You may recall John C. Calhoun initially wanted a large communication network in order to be able to provide for the nation, for the Union, in case of war. He believed that these proposals, the National Bank, tariffs, infrastructure projects, were detrimental to the agrarian interests of the South. The South was focused on agriculture. The South was focused on land. To support the land and the agriculture on that land, they needed slavery. Totally opposed to the North. Totally different, two different cultures. So over these issues, he broke ranks with President Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson wanted to get rid of the National Bank, yes, but not completely, but was not the kind of president that they envisioned him ahead of. When Andrew Jackson was elected the first time, people anticipated that he would be very much in favor of the South. He would be primarily a Southern supporter. Turned out that he was mostly not a Northern supporter or a Southern supporter, a Western supporter. What happens now is that what was West at that time is now South for us. And so thus the confusion. So Jackson disappointed many because of his orientation with the Western, no Western states. There was also a number of differences over cabinet appointments, the deposits from the National Bank, and primarily the 1933 Force Bill. I believe that we discussed this again when South Carolina wanted to interpose itself and annul the tariff, that the president asked Congress for authorization to use the Navy and Army to enforce federal law. And that was supposed to be, or that was envisioned by many, particularly Southern gentlemen, as an abuse of presidential power. And for that, Jackson was heavily criticized by Congress. And actually, he was censured by Congress. So what's the constitutional status of a censure? Yeah, exactly. That was exactly what Jackson said. Sure, go ahead and censure me all you want. Because under the Constitution, there is really no censure. You have a beef against me? Okay, go ahead and impeach me. You can impeach me for bribery, treason, and other crimes and misdemeanors. But you cannot censure me, or you can criticize me all you want. Be my guest. But censure amounts to nothing. So he distanced himself, Tyler, from President Jackson and became an ally of Henry Clay. Henry Clay was the leader of the Whig Party at that time. And Henry Clay sponsored what was called the American system. He believed that the nation, the states, would remain united and work together and live together on the basis of commerce. That commerce and prosperity would maintain the union together, regardless of what else was necessary. So when Tyler joined in censuring Jackson's actions during the nullification crisis, his legislature called him up and said, look, John Tyler, you should not have joined this censure. I think that you should withdraw your vote. Actually, we want you to rescind your vote. And Tyler said, rescind my vote by foot. I'm not going to do that. So he rather resigned from the Senate rather than rescinding his vote over Jackson's censure. So that was the end of the story with John Tyler in the Senate. Was he on good terms with the Democratic Republicans? No.
No.
Was he on good terms with the Whigs?
No.
Not really, with neither.
Yeah.
So he had more or less politically painted himself into a corner. All right, so those were the, we think that these politics are new. No, they're not. They have been going on for hundreds of years. By 1838, a few years later, he had been reelected to the Virginia House, and he had even been appointed Speaker of the Virginia House. So in Virginia, he remained a very, very popular and attractive politician. He was then recognized as a member of the Whig Party. The basis of the Whig Party was opposition to Andrew Jackson's policies. That's the very, very basic. The Whig Party developed out of opposition to Andrew Jackson's politics. John Tyler, by the way, was president of the Virginia Colonization Society, and Henry Clay was president of the National Colonization Society. Did we say a few words about the Colonization Society?
No.
The Colonization Society was made up primarily of wealthy white men. And the purpose of the society was to purchase the freedom of slaves, particularly those who showed promise as far as knowing how to read or write or having some schooling or having some skills. And then helping them leave the United States and go to either Africa or Central America. So that was the idea of the American Colonization Society. Free the country of slaves and have them begin new lives in Africa. Therefore, that's where Monrovia comes from. Or Central America. Some of the countries in Central America were also destined. And this was a very popular plan at that time. Actually, if I get confused because we go into this in detail in the secession classes, and I don't remember what we said here or not. Actually, Lincoln was quite in favor of this program of colonization, of buying people's or slaves' freedoms and helping them get started in other countries. He even proposed something like that to the government as a constitutional amendment in 1862. There is no way around it. This was one of Lincoln's favorite programs and proposals. It never got anywhere. But the colonization societies were really existed up until the 1970s. After the abolition of slavery, they continued to help people who were freedmen at that time leave the country and get started elsewhere. Then they focused on education. Then they focused on health. Finally, by the mid-1970s, they had run out of things to focus, and all these other countries had developed quite a bit, and the colonization society folded. But here in 1816, there is a commemorative coin minted, 1 cent, of the American Colonization Society. And Henry Clay, the leader of the Whigs, was also president of the American Colonization Society. Did you draw something? I thought I. All right.
Now, was that 1 cent, was this legal tender?
At that
Might have
time, probably because it had nickel. It had nickel and copper, and it was valued something.
Well, plus when the American National Bank went out of business too,
Right.
there was a huge explosion of state and local banks that were created, which kind of led to the crash of 37. So it could have been part of that.
Big crash.
Yeah.
Big crash, and it was. It may have bought very little, but it was available. It was available. So in 1940, Henry Clay was the leader of the Whig Party and was the original best candidate early on. But it was recognized by the party folks that Henry Clay could not carry the big states like Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio, New York, because he was too insular, or his edges were too sharp. So therefore, General Harrison, William Henry Harrison, was nominated by the Whigs. General Harrison had been a hero of a battle in Indiana, Tippecanoe, canoe, like 1811.
Tippecanoe and Tyler too.
Exactly. And he was nominated. He knew beans about politics. He was just a military man. But he had become very, very popular because of his activities in the Army. The question has always come up, why was Tyler nominated for vice president? And the article in the Tidewater Times goes into this, but neglects to point out that the most important reason was that he accepted the nomination. I think that he was the fifth man that was offered the nomination. Do you want it? No. Do you want it? No. Do you want it? No. Who wants it? Please, somebody. So he was not the first candidate for the office, but he was the one who agreed to run for the office by the Whig party. He could deliver Virginia votes. There was no question about it. He had been governor, he had been speaker, he had been in the House of Representatives, he had all the connections, he was wealthy, he was a country gentleman, a Virginia gentleman. He had all the requirements for carrying the votes of Virginia. And he was also a consolation prize for those in the party that wanted Henry Clay but could not get Henry Clay in the ticket. So the saying goes, if you cannot have the big prize, we'll give you the second prize. We'll give you an option. This will be like a pacifier, okay? A little something from us for all your efforts. So the election of 1840 was really colorful. And it was fueled by plenty of hard cider. And the saying, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Now, a man called Easy Booze, it's true, packaged his drink in a glass container similar to this, that looks like or has the shape of a log cabin. That is probably why hard liquor is called booze in general, from the election of 1840. That's where the saying comes from. Harrison and Tyler were elected and inaugurated on March 4th, 1841. Now, Tyler was expected or expecting to be totally ignored by the president, totally ignored by the cabinet, totally ignored by the people in Washington. And he was not disappointed. Everybody ignored. So what did he do? He attended the first few functions. He swore in the members of the Senate. And then he took to the road, went back to southeastern Pennsylvania, where he had his big estate, and waited it out. Because the Senate was not in session. The Senate would not be in session for another 8 months. So he had nothing to do. He went back home and he was a country gentleman. On the other hand, old Tippecanoe stayed in Washington and was determined to go out to the market every day, whether it rained or snowed or the sun shone. And he got pneumonia, got very sick, and he died about 6 weeks after being inaugurated. Tyler knew that Harrison was sick. He got word of that. But he said, should I stay home and claim ignorance, or should I go to Washington and be accused of being ready to jump on the office? So he just stayed home until he was told that the president was dead. And then he rushed to Washington. Now, there had never been a situation like that. There had never been a precedent before. Nobody knew what was going to happen. There was a vice president who was supposed to be there in waiting, but if you read the Constitution very carefully, you cannot say that at that time the Constitution said that the vice president would become president. No. Let's go over that. I think that we have a couple of slides for that. In the meantime, while there was a lot of discussion in Washington, Tyler promptly returned to Washington. He called in the cabinet. And the cabinet had met beforehand and had said, well, we need to work with this man somehow while he's acting as president. He called the cabinet and said, gentlemen, my name is Tyler and I'm your president. Please take my oath. So he took the oath. Not only that, he said, you all serve as Secretary of State, Treasury, Attorney General, Navy. You serve at the pleasure of the President. You don't like it? I'll be pleased to accept your resignation. Those are the terms. Not only that, he also moved into the White House physically. Not only that, he demanded to be paid as the president. So he really had this move studied very, very thoroughly. And he was very effective in moving into the presidency. Let's face it, to us, after 160, 70, 80 years of history, and half a dozen presidents dying in office, we take it very naturally, sure, as a president in waiting. But this had never happened before. This was something totally new. These were unexplored waters for the nation at that time. There was a great debate over the next few weeks, and the Constitution was very, very thoroughly scrutinized. What did it say? Well, Article 2, Section 1. Well, we're at it. One more thought. Remember, Article 1 of the Constitution deals with the legislature. Article 2 leads or deals with the executive. What do you think was more important to the founding fathers? The number 1 or the number 2? Number 1. So there is a general idea that at that time, the legislative branch of government was more important than the executive branch of government. At this time, to us, in our reality, it does not seem that way. It seems that the executive branch is more powerful or influential or significant than the legislative. It just seems to us that way, even though they should be co-equal. But Article 2, Section 1 reads that in case of removal or death of the president, the powers and duties of the said office, the powers and duties, both, shall devolve on the vice president. Well, what does that mean? Yeah, exactly. Now, the Constitution was written by very intelligent men who wanted to be very, very precise in what they did. And this is why almost 300 years afterwards, it's still very readable, because it was written very clearly on purpose. But it appears that here they kind of dropped the ball. The same shall devolve on the vice president, and continues Article 2, Section 1. And the Congress may provide for the case of removal, death, and resignation, both of the president and vice president, declaring what officers that shall then act as president, and such officers shall act, the italics are ours, accordingly until the disability be removed or a president shall be elected. You see the emphasis on the word act. and the emphasis on a new election. A new president is elected, which is something we discussed before, that the concept of interim elections was in the laws for a long time, never used, but was in the laws for a long time. Well, this is very interesting, but it leads nowhere. Let's go one more.
So if both the president and the vice president disappeared at the same time, or, killed or whatever, and the House Speaker becomes acting president.
Right.
He doesn't become president, he's only acting there
Acting president.
until there's an election.
Until there's an election.
Okay.
Until there's an interim election. Yes, correct. It never occurred like that.
Right. No, it never has, even
Yeah.
now, even with Nixon.
It will never act. It will never occur unless, there's
Both
a
of them,
law
both of them are killed at the same time.
simultaneously.
Right.
Would it still be with the amendment, what is it, the 24th, 25th, whatever amendment,
25th Amendment.
25th amendment, does that still say act as? It doesn't?
Yeah, the 25th Amendment does not provide for an interim election because the president can nominate a vice president
Right.
that is then approved by Congress.
And if that vice president were to die and it were to go to the Speaker of the House, does that provide for the Speaker of the House simply to act or to become president? So it's also in that 25th Amendment as well.
At that time, I don't think Speaker of the House was in line. It was
No.
cabinet members.
Right.
No, it wasn't
That's
President Pro
today.
Tem, President Pro Tem of the Senate.
Right, President Pro Tem and the Speaker.
And then wasn't
And then
there a
cabinet.
sequence in the cabinet?
Then they eliminated them for a few years, and then in the 20th century, they reversed them again. Speaker of the House would be number 3, and then the President Pro Tem. But let's look at the 12th Amendment. The 12th Amendment in 1804 was in force. Look what it says. If there is no president elected by Inauguration Day, the vice president shall act as president. Okay, so far?
Right.
And this is an explanation. As in the cases of the death or other constitutional disability of the president. It's very, very clear.
Yeah.
That this amendment says that the vice president shall act as president.
But is that referring now to the vice president of the previous administration because there's been no inauguration, no one elected?
Yeah, it wouldn't work
Yes.
today.
Yes, it does, but the important thing is that they cite as an example, as in the cases of the death or other constitutional disability of the president. In other words, we're doing it this way because this is the way we do it. So it's pretty clear, and you can see why there was a lot of debate at that time and a lot of conflict. Eventually, they took the thing to the House of Representatives and the Senate. And in a very extra constitutional way, the House and the Senate voted to allow Tyler to become president. They had actually no power and no constitutional responsibility or authority to do that. But nonetheless, they did.
But it does confuse me, the same thing you said, because the vice president shall act as president if he's not elected before Inauguration Day, which today is unimaginable, but what vice president? The one today, the one that was on the ticket of the president that could not get elected, or?
Now, this applies to a situation in which there is no majority.
Right.
And then the House has to select a president. But if the House is not able to select a president before Inauguration Day, then the vice president shall act
But what,
And
what vice
Which,
The one that
Vice
is,
President
that has just been elected.
yes,
Oh.
they elected.
The vice
Okay.
president-elect
But
shall act as president.
But under our current system, he hasn't been elected either.
that's right.
He would not have been elected either.
So-
That's one of the weaknesses
Yeah.
of
So it's
the,
not the current, what I said, it was the current vice president, the one who was in office before.
no,
That's not correct.
that's not, because their term shall expire at noon.
That's right.
So he's no longer vice president.
Right,
But there is no president.
right.
Or vice
The
president.
Constitution says when the terms will expire, not when they will begin.
That's
So this is why he cannot be the vice president. But the key thing was that the 12th Amendment reads that the vice president shall act as president, like we do in cases of the death or other constitutional disability of the president. So there was a lot of argumentation and grief over this. The honeymoon for President Tyler was short and brief. He was in conflicts with Henry Clay right away. Originally, let me refresh your memory, Tyler was a Jeffersonian Democrat, right?
originally,
Critical thing to remember. And then he went against Jackson, for which he was required to resign from the Senate, basically kicked out by his own party. So he was considered a member of the Whig Party, but Henry Clay was the Whig Party leader and the majority leader in the Senate.
Yeah.
So Henry Clay's presence in the Senate was a sore thumb in his side. Then on August 15th, shortly after becoming president, Tyler vetoed the National Bank bill. Why? Because this is what he believed on all along. Originally, he was against the National Bank. But now that he was president, he could do something about it. So he vetoed the National Bank bill in the summer of 1845. And the excuse was there was an unconstitutional infringement on the rights of the individual states. The eternal struggle between the states and the federal government and the states. Was this a popular move? Very, very unpopular. Where? Everywhere. So what happened? You think unruly mobs are modern, like January 6th? No way. A mob assembled and marched on the White House on August 16th. They protested, soiled the lawn in more than one way, burned Tyler in effigy, sang songs, sent letters full of invective, threatened with physical injury. The mob had to be dispersed by force, and the family had to be protected. Again, because of a veto, because he vetoed the bill about the Bank of the United States. Nothing new, is there? Not at all. A second bank bill was sent a few weeks later, and this time there was no mob. The fighting was inside Congress. It was vetoed by the president, stating that states' legislatures would not have enough control over the bank, and there was a brawl and a fist fight on the floor of the House. and the marshal at arms had to be called and separate the parties, and they have to declare recess. Just like in those third world countries, we see sometimes there are fights in the legislature. Same thing happened there. So there was one mob, and several weeks later, there was a fight on the floor of the House. The troubles did not stop there for Tyler. On September 11th, his whole cabinet resigned, except Daniel Webster, who was the Secretary of State. This was a move engineered by Henry Clay. All the members of the cabinet resigned one by one in person, coming up to the White House, in order to make it impossible for Tyler to govern. If all your heads of departments quit on you, you really cannot run the country. But he was prepared for that. He sent new nominations to the Senate, and he stayed in office. Sure, the Senate returned them back and back and back until they realized it doesn't look that good. We better approve some of these people so that the government goes on. So that round, he won. But that was a pretty big show of power and assertion and self-confidence. When your whole cabinet quits on you, and on the spur of a moment, you have to appoint a new cabinet.
Were any of the resigned cabinet, were they recycled through the Senate?
That I don't know.
Or these were all new people?
I think they were all new people. I think they're new people. This same thing would happen in somewhat another fashion in another few years. And then when there would be another complete turnover of a cabinet, almost overnight. So next fall, we'll come to that same issue. More trouble. On September 13th, the Whigs met in a caucus and decided to expel, or the word they used was excommunicate, get rid of, fire President Tyler from the Whig Party. Big deal, because he was really never a Whig. He was really a Jeffersonian Democrat. He was really anti-Jacksonian. Otherwise, he was a Jeffersonian Democrat. But he became a president without a party. He was neither one side or the other. His appointments were rejected, and he was termed the accidental president. They even began impeachment proceedings, but these never got anywhere. Daniel Webster here was able to negotiate the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, which settled the northern boundary of Maine with England, and that was a very important achievement at that time. The other thing that John Tyler did was, if he received any correspondence addressed to acting President Tyler, he returned it unopened. It had to be addressed to President John Tyler. So the press used to call him the accidental president, or Mr. Accidency.
That was a question in Jeopardy recently.
A couple of years went by, and Tyler considered then a run for a second term. But he was not that popular. He was popular in Virginia. He was popular in the South. But he was not able to gather enough support for election on a national basis. He decided to make the annexation of Texas the main issue of the campaign. And the annexation of Texas is a subject for a whole seminar. It is full of history, it is full of double dealings, it is full of chicanery, it is full of efforts to go around the laws. It's very, very American in the sense that a lot of people try to get away with a lot of things. But what was the big issue? The big issue was that there were so many parties involved in the annexation of Texas. Texas had been part of Mexico. Mexico had been part of Spain. The Louisiana Purchase had been primarily Spanish first, then French, then war, and the areas west of the Mississippi were in question for a long time. Then Texas had withdrawn from Mexico. Mexico had wanted to have or had asked Americans to come into Texas and populate Texas, provided they would become Catholics, provided they would give up slavery, provided they would speak Spanish. Those were the requirements that Mexico had for Americans going into Texas. Well, what happened? Americans went into Texas, they brought their slaves, they remained Americans, and they did not necessarily become Catholics. And they continued to speak English. But they stayed there, so that was a problem. The Texans were very, very afraid that if they began to have negotiations with the United States, Mexico would send in the army into Texas and occupy Texas. Mexico at that time had a larger army than the United States. There's no question about it. It was much larger, much more powerful. And the United States did not want to have any conflict with either Mexico or with Texas. More problems. England was also involved. The English did not want the United States to move any farther west. Remember the 49-40 or fights? Because mostly of the Northwest territories. Well, that's what the time when these allegations were being made. Not enough. France was also involved. France had lent Mexico and Texas a lot of money. And they were afraid that if there was a conflict with the United States, they would renege on their debt. And they would end up losing all that money. So France did not want any conflict either. But at that time, France was always the enemy or the opponent of England. So whatever position England took, France took the opposite. So there were many, many factors involved in the annexation of Texas. Actually, the map, as you see here, is quite different from the shape of Texas nowadays. This is the Gulf of Mexico down here. This is the Nueces River. The Rio Grande is 100 miles farther south. And the shape of Texas is very, very dissimilar to the modern map of Texas we are used to.
Is that Red River at the top? Is that the one that's up in the Dakotas?
Red River. No, I don't think that is that it comes from way up there.
Yeah, I wondered how far north this thing's going.
No, it may be another Red River.
Oh, okay.
So I think we went over this. There was Mexican invasion, conflict, England and France conflict over the Northwest territories. Texas did. When Texas became or pulled away from Mexico, things did not go well for Texas. So Texas ended up with about $10 million in debt, money that they had borrowed. At that time, that was an enormous amount of money, and they just did not have any way of repaying. One of the reasons why Texans wanted to be absorbed by the United States was hoping that the federal government would assume responsibility for that debt. It's a pure question of finances. There was also a problem with land. Texas claimed territory in what is mostly now New Mexico. They claimed that all this land belonged to Texas. There was also the Panhandle, parts of Wyoming, Colorado, and a little bit of Arkansas over here. All of this territory, Texas claimed, and all this territory had been included apparently in the Louisiana Purchase. So the United States had federal troops in various places, but Texas had also sent the military into these territories, and a conflict appeared inevitable. So there was going to be a sort of state versus government, the federal government conflict there. Everybody wanted to avoid it. There was no point in avoiding it. It was only a question of, is this land ours or is this land yours? So the annexation of Texas took place in a very heated atmosphere and through very, very irregular ways. First, there was a secret treaty with Texas that was presented to the Senate the day before the Senate was going to adjourn at the very last minute, hoping that they would vote and approve it without public hearings or without the press knowing or without any of the usual procedures. Fortunately, that did not pass. It was rejected by 2-1 vote. There were also secret channels of communication. I mean, this really beats Watergate by far, because they had documents leaked to the press, sometimes secret diplomatic documents. Secret funds were maintained and dispersed. A lot of bribery went on. Unconstitutional promises made, like if Mexico invades Texas, fine, the United States will immediately declare war on Mexico. You can't make a promise like that. That's the executive cannot do that. Only the legislature can declare war. Political positions were reversed. Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, they were for annexation, then they went against annexation, declared publicly, totally flip-flopped their positions. One of the fears of the northern states was that Texas, being so big, could be split into 4 or 5 states, each of which would have 2 senators. 2 more senators from 4 or 5 states coming from the South, that would really tip the balance of power in the Senate towards the South. So there were people in the North who wanted the annexation of Texas, like those who wanted to invest in real estate and advance commerce in that way. And on the other hand, there were those who were afraid of giving the southern states just too much power. In any event, Texas was finally admitted, not by treaty, but by a joint resolution, which requires only a majority vote. A treaty requires a 2/3 vote in the Senate, just as Tyler's term was expiring. Of course, that was not enough for him to get reelected. So at the end of his term, he retreated or he retired to his estate in southeastern Virginia. One of the things that I wanted to point out was that I did not get a chance to put it in slides. I have it in my own set of slides, but not of these. You have the power of the word. Was that Tyler was involved in an interesting accident called the accident on the Princeton, the USS Princeton. It was in 1842, Tyler became a widower. His wife died of natural causes, and he had like 7 children, 7 or 8. Many children. He was in his mid-50s. So he was a widower in the White House with a handful of children. After about a year and a half or 2, he became acquainted with a lady from the North. Her name was Julia, her last name will come to me, who was about 30 years younger than he was. He said, oh, there's nothing wrong with a younger chick. But she said, no, I'd rather have a younger man. One spring afternoon in 1843, or 43, yeah, 1843, the president and a number of people from Washington took off on the USS Princeton on a cruise down the Potomac. There were a lot of dignitaries on board, important people. It was mostly for fun. The Princeton was a sailing ship that had been equipped with 2 very large cannons. They were like 10, 11 inches in bore. I could shoot a ball about 5 miles. So on the way down, they decided to fire the cannon. Boom, they fired the cannon, and everybody laughed. Nothing happened. And they went down to the mouth of the Potomac and then turned around. On the way back, they were going by Mount Vergne. And they decided to fire again the cannon to honor George Washington. All right? So they fired the cannon, but the breech exploded. And there was metal thrown in every direction at great speed with great power. 6 people were killed immediately, including the Secretary of State, Secretary of the Navy, Tyler's own valet, and Julia's father, who was also on board when the cannon exploded. Julia fainted when they gave her the news. And once the ship returned to port in Alexandria, old man Tyler carried her off the ship like a babe in arms. She did not remember very much about this, but was so moved by the happenings that she considered, Tyler's proposal. And they were married about a year later. And they had like 7 children together. So that's the story of the Princeton and Julia and John Tyler. After his term was completed, Tyler returned to his property in Virginia, in Williamsburg, for the next 15 years, and had a lot of children, and was a very successful planter and Virginia gentleman. He resurfaced again during the secession crisis. In the winter of 1861, the United States legislature had met, but had been totally unable to come up with any solution to the secession crisis. The secession crisis, to put it short, came on after about, let's say, 20 years of agitation. And it was the election of Lincoln that really brought things to a head. In any event, regardless of how hard the House of Representatives tried, they formed a committee of 33 that proposed a number of constitutional amendments, none of which was satisfactory to both parties. The Senate had also a select committee and proposed a number of amendments, none of which was agreeable to all parties. The states finally decided to do something about it. So the Washington Peace Conference was held at the Willard's Hotel in Washington. I think 130 some individuals came from most of the states except the far western states, Minnesota, and the states that had seceded. All the other states, they sent in their best politicians, former governors, former Supreme Court justices, former senators, former Secretary of States. Everybody and his uncle who had been anywhere in government came up to this conference. John Tyler had been appointed special messenger to the President of the United States by the governor of Virginia. John Tyler was still respected in Virginia as perhaps its most eminent politician at that time. And Tyler was elected president of the Washington Peace Conference. The Washington Peace Conference came up with a number of proposals which were very, very similar to what John Crittenden from the Senate had previously proposed. It did not come up with anything new. Everything that was there that could be proposed had been proposed. Even a constitutional amendment that would forbid the Congress from outlawing slavery forever and ever. And that amendment has never been withdrawn. It's still out there. It will never get anywhere, but it's still out there. It's one of the amendments that have never been ratified, but have never been withdrawn. So when the Washington Conference, the Peace Conference, adjourned, John Tyler went back into to Virginia, and he became a member of the Confederate provisional government. And he was also elected to the General Assembly or the legislature of the Confederate government. He died shortly afterwards. And he never actually met with the other legislatures. But he was elected as a member of the Confederate government. When he died in Washington, D.C., his death was totally ignored. Completely ignored. Why? Because he was felt at that time to have been a traitor. Because he had taken an oath to protect, defend, and what else? Maintain, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Notice that the oath is to protect, defend, and preserve the Constitution, not the United States, not the states, not the government, the Constitution. And for that reason, his death was totally ignored in Washington, D.C. And he's buried in Virginia. So that's the story of John Tyler, the man who first became president after being elected vice president. People are very divided on their assessment of Tyler. People saying historians and critics and professors and academicians and the like. One argument can be made was that at that time there was really no United States citizenship. It required the 14th Amendment to establish United States citizenship. That individuals were considered or considered themselves at that time citizens of their state, not of the United States. So being no citizenship of the United States, it is difficult to ascertain for sure that John Tyler or anybody else was a traitor. How many Southerners were tried for treason after the Civil War? There were a few. There were a few.
Jefferson Davis was, wasn't he?
For treason.
Yes.
Robert E. Lee was treated for treason. He
Lost his citizenship.
He was
Jefferson Davis.
But Lee was pardoned by Grant.
Jefferson Davis was held without
Right.
for over a year. How about Alexander Stephens? He was vice president and was re-elected to the federal House of Representatives. He was never tried for treason. For one thing, they did not want to try these men that in the South were revered and really turned everybody off again against the federal government. They wanted to get things together. It was very much like Nixon's party.
Right.
That a lot of people had very conflicting feelings about it because you wanted to make peace and go on with your life. So that's one of the arguments that really John Tyler was really not a traitor because there was no citizenship of the United States at that time. And he really went with his state rather than with his nation, which was the way to go at that time. This is what was expected of politicians and of citizens in general. The one thing that few people argue is how assertive he was, how he gave the presidency a lot of power and asserted its primacy. At that time, the presidency was not the number one position in government. Well, he initiated that. When he came in and said, gentlemen, I'm the president. And if you don't like it, thank you for your resignation. It was very simple. When he moved into the White House, when he demanded his salary as president, when he took on the whole government, when his cabinet departed on short notice, he said, fine, you want to leave, be my guest. More will come in. Somebody else will come in. So he had a lot of powerful attributes as far as being a powerful executive. He faced in that first summer one crisis after the other, after the other, after the other. And he persevered, he stayed on. And he was able to weather all of these crises over and over again. So some historians believe that the beginning of the powerful presidency that we are used to nowadays began with the actions of John Tyler when he first became vice president. All right. What do you think of Mr. Tyler? Interesting life.
Yeah. And then, I mean, he becomes our first caretaker president, basically. And there have been a few, and they've all been pretty insignificant. Yeah.
His role is setting a precedent for the presidency, the vice president assuming that presidency. I assume that's why that you said precedent in the title, longer, so that makes complete sense. Because he then went against the Constitution, supposedly, or the interpretation. And I think it's amazing what he accomplished by doing that. Because that's what followed, Johnson and then on in.
Yeah. Could he have functioned as such nowadays?
Is
You
acting
mean
president?
as a president without a party?
Yeah. Maybe it'd be better. I don't know.
Yeah.
Remember Nixon really was deserted by the Republicans towards the end of his term.
Right.
No, he could not get the Lord's Prayer through the Congress at all. That's when they denied funding for the Vietnam War. That's why they had to close things up.
A president who was deserted by his party, they probably would be impeached. And if he didn't have votes of his own party, he would be removed, because the other party would, of course, would vote against him,
That is a new development,
Right.
Impeachment is really a new development. It's been there for a long time, but it was only for major crimes, misdemeanors, treason, bribery.
Right.
They made it very, very, very clear that they did not want to have presidents impeached on the concept of maladministration.
Right.
That was one of the ideas that they floated around. They said, no, we're not going to put in maladministration.
Would you say that with the impeachments that occurred, that they have used crimes and misdemeanors for the charges? Because when you think about when Andrew Johnson, he fired Stanton. So,
Some say that an impeachable offense is whatever Congress wants it to be.
let's look at that and concur with that.
But primarily it has been a political crime, a serious political crime like obstruction of justice. That and this is what, if you remember when Nixon was under pressure, it was Goldwater who really broke the bubble when he went to the White House and said, look, if what I hear is true, I cannot but vote yes on obstruction of justice.
But look at Clinton's impeachment.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a,
Yeah.
My recollection was that Clinton was impeached for
Perjury.
perjury.
For perjury.
Okay.
But perjury may be a legal crime, but it's not a political crime.
That's no.
And they made it very clear originally when they were writing the Constitution that the crimes for which people would be impeached were to be political crimes, not legal crimes. Let's go to take a moment here to ask, what do we as individuals and citizens expect of the Vice President?
To support the president.
Okay, support the president.
That is baseline.
Yeah.
To be a public presence.
Yeah.
Then should the vice president have an identical image of things as the president, or just be supportive?
Mostly
Be
supportive.
supportive.
Could they differ in opinions?
They can to a
Yes.
degree, yeah.
Well, if you're gonna balance your ticket, you're gonna have different views, or you may have different views.
Because the vice president is really the only individual that the president cannot discharge. The vice president is there for the duration. And we have seen several people who have differences with the president, and it did not end up in a pretty situation. And we'll see when, probably next year, when we discuss the vice presidents of the 20th century, how the same thing happened with FDR and his vice presidents.
I heard an interview on the radio recently of a new book that came out about Truman and his vice presidency. Have you heard of it?
No,
Because I tried to find it at Amazon, and I couldn't because it was talking about his role as vice president, and it was more significant than most of us thought. He was getting into that.
well, Mr. Truman was really marginalized. He wasn't told anything about the A-bomb. He was not told anything about war secrets.
This indicated that he was involved in some sort of defense situation. And actually, I don't know anything about it.
Now, that's the image that has been developed over time. Truman was head of a committee to investigate many of the war deals and promotions and construction and contracts.
Okay.
He probably knew about the Manhattan Project. He may not have known the details, that it was a super bomb. But all those monies going into this one project must have attracted his attention. So it may be that he was summoned to the Pentagon, and the general said, look, Senator Truman, this is a very sensitive project. We'd rather not talk about it. Let's make believe that you don't know anything about it. It involves something top secret. So he probably knew about it because his committee investigated all the contracts. And, but he probably did not know the details, that it was like splitting atoms and creating a weapon of mass destruction. But the image of him being set aside, marginalized, that has been cultivated for many years. And it may have been very, very accurate, but he probably knew about it, but not the details. What else do we expect our vice presidents to be besides supportive?
An ambassador for the office of the president.
All right?
More recent terms, president has given the vice president some specific responsibilities. That's not historic, but they're more recent
Yes.
administrations.
Al Gore was given or took the initiative to talk about climate change, and he made a documentary in 2006, which was released on a limited release.
Today, it's on May 24th.
Yeah,
Really?
today.
Oh, okay.
This was spring.
So we expect the vice president also to be a spokesperson
Yes.
Right.
for the administration, supported to be a spokesperson. Can the president give any authority to the vice president?
Not according to our constitution.
Now, apparently that's quite
And
correct.
there is no pay.
What?
Still?
Yeah, no, the vice president makes $231,000 a year,
Okay.
plus the house on
They've always been.
one observatory circle, and all the perks. And all the flying and whatnot. Yeah,
Okay.
well, she's not hurting.
Has that always helped?
No vice president is hurting. What else do we expect about the vice president? Given the fact that the Constitution is so limited, can we think of anything else?
It's more of a political thing than anything. We expect them to balance the ticket. We expect them to bring in certain states or whatever. We expect them to represent different constituencies. So, but that's a political thing. That's not a,
All right, from what I have read, generally speaking, the public tends to vote primarily for who is on the top level. That is, that in favor of. But the person on the vice presidential ballot may hurt the president.
Sarah Palin.
True.
Have you read the same thing?
Yeah.
Generally speaking?
yeah, but Lyndon Johnson, on the other hand, was a big help to
Yeah, at that time, Johnson was very, very popular in Texas. And he was able to deliver Texas
right. So,
at that time.
but generally, you're right. That generally, the vice president can hurt rather than help.
But then we have seen some vice presidents that have been very, very weak and certainly unknown. Spiro Agnew was very, very unknown when he was elected with Nixon.
Yep.
And then Quayle was a very, very minor character in Congress when he was elected with Bush 41.
Yep.
And then on the other hand, we have people like Che, who came in with tremendous experience in government. We may not agree with his politics, but he had enormous know-how and connections and whatnot.
And sometimes the president won't choose a vice president who will be too strong. I mean, so they will look, and I was thinking of Reagan, it seems to me that, I don't remember who, but there was somebody there that he could have chosen and he didn't because that he was afraid of competition, or I don't know if that's the right word.
That's very, 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 very accurate. Leading to the next corollary, which would be that a president does not want a vice president that will cast a shadow on him. The reverse side of that coin You can think of like the Nixon-Agnew relationship. As long as Agnew was vice president, Nixon was safe as president. Once Agnew was removed, then Nixon was defenseless. Think about it that way. I don't think Nixon would have resigned if Agnew had been vice president. And in our next cycle, we will address the same issue when we talk about Andrew Johnson.
Yeah.
Why Andrew Johnson was impeached but lost by 1 vote.
Yeah.
And then we will analyze why that 1 vote.
Well, the story is, of course, JFK was talking about how it became a profile of courage. But recently they've discovered that that vote was probably bribed. You know, that it was 1 vote.
1 vote.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a very, very pleasant experience. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.